In the 4th century BC, the Greek mainland was incredibly wealthy and culturally advanced, but it was also completely decentralized. The Greeks had organized themselves into hundreds of independent city-states, fiercely individualistic and constantly at war with one another. This map shows the scale of the geopolitical threat they faced to the east. While the Greeks squabbled in their fractured territories, the Persian Empire had consolidated everything from Egypt to India under a single massive superpower, one that had already tried to invade the Greek mainland twice. But on the northern periphery of Greece, King Philip II of Macedon was building a solution. He centralized his kingdom and completely overhauled his military, developing the Macedonian phalanx. This was a dense block of infantry armed with the sarissa, a massive 6-meter-long pike that allowed his soldiers to form an impenetrable shield wall, neutralizing standard infantry charges. Philip also secured the intellectual future of his dynasty. He hired the great polymath Aristotle to tutor his young heir, Alexander. Aristotle taught him philosophy and political science, but he also introduced the boy to the Iliad. From those ancient pages, Alexander developed an obsession with the mythical warriors of the Trojan War and a deep, driving hunger for military glory. In 336 BC, King Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. At just 20 years old, Alexander seized the throne. He immediately put his domestic rivals to the sword and marched south to violently crush a rebellion by the Greek city-states, burning the wealthy city of Thebes to the ground to ensure absolute compliance. Alexander did not have to spend decades building a state from scratch. He inherited a highly disciplined, technologically advanced war machine from his father. With Greece thoroughly subdued, he immediately pointed that machine east, straight at the Persian Empire. Just 2 years after taking power, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia. He brought exactly 50,000 men with him. It was a brazen, hyper-aggressive land invasion against a Persian military apparatus that mathematically dwarfed his own forces. But Alexander operated on a policy of pure forward momentum. When he arrived in the city of Gordium, he was presented with the Gordian knot, a famously complex mass of ropes that local legends said could not be untied. Alexander examined it briefly, drew his sword, and hacked it in half. He refused to let complex obstacles slow his advance. That same blunt force logic applied on the battlefield. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander faced the Persian king Darius III. Realizing the Persians had superior numbers, Alexander ignored the wider battle lines. He personally led a concentrated cavalry strike and charged directly at Darius. The Persian king panicked and fled, causing his entire army to break ranks and rout. Following the victory, Alexander made a calculated strategic pivot. Rather than chasing Darius deep into the Persian interior, he turned south down the Mediterranean coast. He besieged the island fortress of Tyre for 7 grueling months, taking out the Persian naval fleet by capturing their ports from the land. Continuing south, he arrived in Egypt in 332 BC. The Egyptians surrendered without a fight, welcoming him as a liberator. Alexander traveled to their temples, made offerings to their gods, and laid the foundations for a sprawling new port city near the Nile Delta, naming it Alexandria. By securing the entire Levantine coast and Egypt, Alexander eliminated the threat of a Persian naval counterattack. With his rear flank and supply lines completely secure, he had engineered a safe, permanent bridge for a deep land invasion of Mesopotamia. The fatal blow to Persian sovereignty came a year later at the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius had amassed a massive army, but Alexander's disciplined phalanxes easily absorbed the Persian chariot charges, breaking the lines and sending Darius fleeing into the mountains one final time. Alexander marched into Mesopotamia, capturing the wealthiest cities of the ancient world. He pushed into the Zagros Mountains, took the capital city of Persepolis, looted its massive treasury, and burned its great palaces to the ground. The Persian royal line was finished. This map illustrates his next decision. He had achieved his original objective, but instead of stopping to govern his vast new territory, Alexander ordered his men to keep marching east. He pushed them out of Persia and into the harsh, freezing, and largely unexplored mountain ranges of Bactria and the Hindu Kush. As the army moved deeper into Asia, Alexander's behavior shifted. He began dressing in Persian royal robes and demanding proskynesis, an Eastern court ritual requiring subjects to prostrate themselves and kiss the floor before the king. To his Greek officers, who prided themselves on individual liberty, this looked exactly like the despotism they had originally set out to destroy. The campaign into India extracted a brutal toll. At the Hydaspes River, the Hellenic army suffered heavy casualties fighting King Porus and his massive war elephants. It was here that Alexander's lifelong horse, Bucephalus, finally collapsed and died from the extreme physical exertion. Following the battle, scouts brought news of what lay further east, the Nanda Empire, a state controlling the Ganges River with an army of hundreds of thousands of men. Realizing their king intended to march until he hit the end of the world, the Greek and Macedonian soldiers mutinied. They refused to take another step. Alexander's tactical brilliance allowed him to dismantle every physical army placed in front of him. But no military strategy could overcome the psychological breaking point of his own exhausted men. Reluctantly, he turned the army around. The grueling march back west cost thousands of lives in the deserts of Central Asia. Arriving in the city of Susa, Alexander attempted an aggressive, forced cultural integration, ordering 10,000 of his Greek and Macedonian soldiers to marry Persian women in a massive, deeply resented ceremony. But he would never see those forced alliances mature. In Babylon, while preparing for an Arabian expedition, Alexander developed a sudden fever. After days of deteriorating health, and amidst persistent rumors that his disillusioned officers had poisoned his wine, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. Here is a map showing the immediate aftermath of his death. Because he left no mature heir, his leading generals, known as the Diadochi, instantly turned on each other. A brutal civil war erupted, tearing the newly forged empire apart into rival kingdoms. Meanwhile, the territories at the very edge of the map, the regions in Bactria and India, rapidly slipped away, reverting entirely to the control of local lords. The unified state collapsed, but the cultural impact was permanent. By seeding dozens of cities across Eurasia, Alexander triggered the Hellenistic period. Greek architecture, science, and political philosophy permanently fused with Eastern traditions, creating an intellectual network spanning from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. His physical borders barely survived his own lifetime, yet by dragging a Western army into the heart of Central Asia, Alexander left a geographic and cultural blueprint that dictated the course of human history for centuries to come. By the middle of the 4th century BC, the Greek city-states had spent decades locked in exhausting, destructive infighting. This left them deeply vulnerable to the sprawling, unified superpower sitting right next door, the mighty Persian Empire. The solution to this eastern threat came from the mountainous northern territory of Macedonia. King Philip II built a revolutionary military force centered around a single innovation, the sarissa. The sarissa was an 18-foot-long wooden pike, roughly twice the length of a standard Greek spear. Professional soldiers wielded these massive pikes in a packed formation known as the phalanx. By standing shoulder to shoulder, Six planned a massive invasion of Persia. But on the eve of his grand campaign, he was assassinated by his own bodyguard. This specialized military force fell to his son, an experienced 20-year-old commander named Alexander. Alexander used these soldiers to carve out a 3,000-mile stretch of territory spanning 3 continents. Over 10 years, his own isolation and the growing resentment of his inner circle became more dangerous to his reign than any Persian army. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander marched his forces into Asia Minor. Waiting to trap him at tight river crossings and narrow coastal plains were formidable multi-ethnic Persian armies, defended by elite, heavily armed guards. This animated diagram shows how Alexander relied on a tactic known as hammer and anvil to break these forces. Because of its sheer density and overlapping spears, the slow-moving Macedonian phalanx acted as the anvil, locking into a prolonged collision with a much longer enemy line, pinning them in place. With the enemy occupied, Alexander executed the hammer blow. He led his companion cavalry in a high-speed flank charge that pierced directly into the enemy's rear command. Alexander didn't observe these charges from a safe distance. He fought in the thick of the melee, taking a sword blow to the head that split his helmet at the Granicus River, and personally charging King Darius at the Battle of Issus. By constantly risking his own life at the absolute front of the line, he forged a fanatical loyalty among his troops. The final clash of the conventional war took place on the open plains of Gaugamela. Here, Alexander was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and worse, the Persians had meticulously flattened the terrain to maximize the impact of their scythed chariots and war elephants. Looking at this map of the battlefield, you can see Alexander's trap. He began drifting his right wing outward. Fearing encirclement, the Persians mirrored this movement, stretching their own line until a distinct gap tore open right in their center. Alexander immediately abandoned his outward drift, violently reversed direction, and drove his cavalry straight into that weakened gap. The sudden shock shattered the Persian command structure, sending King Darius fleeing. With the Persian army broken, Alexander marched unopposed into Babylon and ceremonially took his seat on the throne at Persepolis, the empire's vast royal capital. The pan-Greek war of revenge that his father planned was officially over. His men had captured the Persian treasuries and could have returned to Macedonia as wealthy legends. Instead, Alexander's ambition overrode the original mission, driving the army further east into territory they had never seen before. The sweeping set-piece battles on open plains were replaced by a grueling march into the territories of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia. Isolated among the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, the Greek army was bogged down in a frustrating guerrilla war against local nomadic tribes. To appease his new subjects and maintain control over these vast territories, Alexander began integrating former enemies into his command and adopting the traditional dress of his defeated Persian adversaries. The cultural friction intensified over a ritual called proskynesis. Alexander demanded that his Greek soldiers prostrate themselves, bowing face down on the ground before him. To the Greeks, this was an unforgivable blasphemy, a gesture of submission strictly reserved for the gods. The intense resistance to these changes bred deep paranoia within his inner circle. When Alexander uncovered a plot against his life, he executed his top general, Parmenion. Shortly after, during a drunken rage, he murdered Clitus, the very cavalry officer who had saved his life in combat years earlier. The Macedonian army suffered its most difficult tactical engagement in India at the Hydaspes River. Here, Alexander's Greek forces suffered terrible casualties fighting their way through a wall of towering Indian war elephants. They had marched thousands of miles over 8 years. Exhausted and alienated by a leader who now closely resembled the foreign autocrats they originally set out to destroy, the undefeated Macedonian army simply stopped walking. They mutinied, refusing to march a single step further. Furious but out of options, Alexander was forced to turn back. He led his army through the punishing Gedrosian Desert, a route where extreme heat, thirst, and starvation killed thousands of the very men who had survived his entire military campaign. Upon returning to Babylon, Alexander's closest confidant, Hephaestion, died of a sudden illness. Just months later, as he planned his next invasion, Alexander himself contracted a mysterious fever and died at the age of 32. This map shows the immediate political fallout. Because the empire was bound together entirely by Alexander's sheer force of personality rather than durable institutions, his generals immediately tore it apart. Within years, the unified landmass fractured into rival, warring kingdoms. But while his political structure collapsed, the decade of fighting distributed Greek science, art, and governance across thousands of miles. These classical amphitheater ruins on the coast of Egypt provide physical evidence of the campaign's lasting result, integrating Greek culture into Eastern traditions. Alexander built a military system proving a single, unmatched tactical mind can conquer the known world. But as the total splintering of his life's work showed, without a shared vision extending beyond one man's personal ambition, no empire survives its architect.